Hello and welcome to the second lecture in the Understanding Security series. So this week we're going to be looking at traditional security, otherwise known as the national security paradigm, the sort of stuff that a realist would recognise. So according to traditional definitions of security, traditional ways of thinking about security, security meant the security and the defence of a nation state. And the security of the population, the security of the citizens, was assumed to be pretty much synonymous with that. So primarily we were talking about security against external threats. So the main threats were seen to be other states. Although of course it could also encompass internal threats to the state or the regime as well, such as insurgency, maybe up to a point things like terrorism, other types of military or quasi-military threat, but principally we tended to be looking at security against threats from other states. Now, of course, today, as we said in the last lecture, definitions of security have broadened, but many of the other dimensions of security that we'll be looking at in later lectures also have potentially national security implications as well. So when we look at things like health security or economic security or energy security, we will be looking at those from kind of a human security paradigm as well, but they also have potentially national security implications. Economics is kind of the cornerstone of state power ultimately. You can't have, for example, a powerful military if you don't have the economic base to support it. Energy could be used as a weapon in war, for example. So if embargoes of oil supplies or other kinds of energy supplies were in place, then that obviously has significant national security implications. So it's not necessarily all about military stuff, but traditionally, conventionally, the focus has been largely on military defence. So, state-on-state warfare will be the main focus of this week's lecture. So how do states go about securing themselves against external threats? And how can states be expected to behave in response to external threats? And again, particularly from a realist perspective. So the theoretical underpinnings for this week are largely coming from a realist perspective. So the national security concept, in one sense, is relatively new, and by new I mean a few hundred years old, in that it's only as old as the concept of the Westphalian nation-state itself, which of course has only really been around since 1648 in its kind of present form. So if we kind of go back to, certainly to the medieval period, there was no real concept, not just of national security, but there's no real concept of the nation-state as we understand it today. Yes, there were kingdoms in the medieval period, but at that time armies fought for personal loyalty to a lord, a king or another lord, rather than some abstract concepts like the nation or the state. Now this began to change in the late Middle Ages when the idea of the nation started to emerge, so particularly during the 100 Years' War, for example, between England and France. This kind of long period of protracted warfare helped to bring about the distinct sense of national identity on both sides. Because prior to this, England and France had been to some extent a single civilization. And certainly since the Norman conquest, England had been ruled by a French-speaking Norman elite. So, in a sense, they were kind of one civilization. But the 100 Years' War and the protracted conflict between the two sides helped to kind of create the idea of nation. The English were the English because they weren't French, and vice versa. The French were the French because they weren't English. So the idea of nation and defence of the nation, I guess, has its roots at this time, but nonetheless, service to a king was still central at that time. So, as we know, the Treaty of Westphalia marked the emergence of the modern concept of the sovereign state, and with it, the idea of fixed borders and the need to defend those borders, to defend the state against primarily other states. And the following century, we saw dramatic events in the shape of the US War of Independence, or the US Revolution, essentially, and also the French Revolution, both of which took place in the latter part of the 18th century. And following this, or during this, actually, during these revolutions, citizens' armies for the first time were fighting in defence of their community as a nation, not in terms of personal loyalty to a king or a lord. In fact, they were fighting against that. Certainly, the US, the US War of Independence, of course, the American colonists fought to throw off British rule and to establish themselves as independent. So yes, obviously you have figures like George Washington, you had major generals, and Washington later became the president, of course, the first president. But it wasn't about personal loyalty to Washington so much as the idea of themselves as a separate people, a separate nation. And again, similar to the wars following the French Revolution, and shading into the Napoleonic period. For the first time, you had these large-scale citizens' armies who were fighting for loyalty to the concept of the nation itself rather than loyalty to a king or a leader. Moving into the 19th century, again the idea of national security was closely tied to state sovereignty and to the defence of territory. So national security mainly meant maintaining strong armies, protecting borders, and balancing power among great powers. Of course, the UK was slightly different because the UK was an island. Or actually two islands at that time. The whole of Ireland, of course, was part of the UK. And the UK was different because of its island nature. It relied primarily on the Royal Navy for defence rather than a land army. But of course, also the British Army was employed particularly in the colonies, and again, colonial empires were kind of considered, as part of the colonising powers' territory and security interests. In the 20th century, the concept broadened. So after the First World War, security began to be reconceptualised in a different way. And again, without kind of going into that in any depth, because we don't have time at the moment, but if you kind of look at some of my other lectures, particularly the lecture on liberalism, I talk about the League of Nations and the kind of the rise of the idea of collective security in the wake of the First World War. So for the first time, the idea that security could be achieved through international cooperation as opposed to realist style self-help and maybe military alliances among a few powers. Then we have the Second World War, and then of course the Cold War, and the sort of dominant concepts in that era were, of course, the idea of the balance of power, but also nuclear deterrence and the invention of nuclear weapons changed things quite substantially, in the sense that the stakes were much higher. The idea of mutually assured destruction, the knowledge that a nuclear war cannot be won and therefore must not be fought, and strategic policy therefore centered around the idea of defence. But still, in many respects, an old-fashioned realist world. A world of two great opposing alliances, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and associated other alliances in other parts of the world as well. So in that respect, we're still talking very much a realist world, a realist conception of what national security meant. But again, as I said in the previous lecture, the national security paradigm started to, as it had previously been understood, started to be challenged towards the end of the Cold War and after the Cold War, late 20th century. The expansion of the idea of security, and including national security, to include things like economic strength, political stability, energy security, and later on even things like human rights and environmental concerns and so on, started to be seen potentially as aspects of not just security but national security. So, if we're thinking about modern warfare, we can identify 5 dimensions of modern warfare: land, sea, air, space and cyber. So the first 2, of course, have been around for a very long time, for thousands of years. Air warfare, of course, became a thing more recently, from kind of the First World War onwards. Space more recently still, from kind of the middle of the 20th century. And cyber warfare has emerged very recently as this new but very important, very significant dimension of modern warfare. So looking at land warfare, first of all, if we think of land warfare, we're probably going to think of things like soldiers with assault rifles, we're going to think of things like tanks, and these things are still important, of course, in modern land warfare. We're going to think of things like artillery. But also, I think we have to recognise that new technologies are potentially becoming important as well. So, particularly the idea of drones. And again, drones can take many forms. When we talk about drones, we often think about flying drones, but land-based sort of military robots as well. So if we look at the image at kind of the bottom right, it kind of looks almost like a mini tank, if you like, armed with a machine gun. But it's basically a remote-controlled robot. And again, robot warfare is likely to become increasingly important as we move forward. And of course, one of the big issues is the potential application of artificial intelligence to these robots, because if they become kind of AI enabled, then they have the potential to be autonomous, not necessarily under direct human control at all. And there are lots of ethical implications around that, and even legal implications around that. So again, what happens, for example, if the thing goes rogue? If it shoots some civilians, for example, which would be a clear breach of the rules of war, would be a clear breach of the Geneva Conventions. But who do you hold accountable for that? If a soldier shoots some civilians, then the soldier is responsible. And even saying I was acting under orders is not an excuse. That was established at Nuremberg. But if a robot were to commit a war crime, then who is responsible? Is it the general, the military officer that deployed the thing? Is it the government that deployed it? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the programmer? Who exactly do you hold responsible? That's not clear. And more broadly, I think just the very idea of machines making decisions independently to kill humans seems kind of a bit, a bit off. It's kind of almost shades of Terminator. I can't say that I'm particularly comfortable with that idea. Turning to naval warfare, so again, we can think of things like aircraft carriers and nuclear-powered submarines, which of course, are kind of the capital ships of the present day in terms of sea control, in terms of power projection. We also probably think of things like destroyers and frigates, carrying out tasks like air defence and anti-submarine warfare and protection of convoys and so on. And naval warfare again remains extremely important, because if you can control the seas, potentially you can control the world. If you and particularly if your if your opponent if your enemy is kind of dependent on international trade, being able to cut off their supply lines via sea routes is potentially devastating. So the sea is very, very important for power projection, for both offence and for defence. But alongside these kind of more traditional types of naval vessel, we also have, again in the bottom right corner, we have an example of an underwater drone. So drones, again, have the potential to become increasingly important at sea. And particularly if this thing was made to be nuclear powered, it would be a very, very dangerous weapon, because the main thing that kind of limits crewed nuclear submarines is the crew. Nuclear submarines don't need to be refueled for years or sometimes decades, so they could stay submerged and, at least with current technology, largely undetectable for an unlimited period of time. But the main limiting factor is the food supply and the crew's sort of needs, including mental health needs, of course. Being cooped up inside a submarine, submerged for weeks or months, is very, very hard on mental health. So it's the limitations of the crew, really, which are the main limitation on how long a crewed nuclear submarine can remain submerged. But of course, a robot doesn't have these problems, so it could stay submerged and more or less undetectable, potentially for years at a time, and capable, if it's armed with torpedoes or whatever, capable of doing a lot of damage. And again, it may well be equipped with artificial intelligence so that it can make its own decisions and operate autonomously. So once again, lots of potential ethical concerns and legal concerns around that. Air warfare. So again, think of air warfare. We'll think of things like stealth bombers dropping bombs. We'll think of things like jet fighters, maybe things like attack helicopters. But once again, drones are revolutionising air warfare. And again, the conflict in Ukraine is giving some really important lessons as to the real importance of drones in modern warfare. And the thing about these drones, as you see, the one on kind of the bottom right, it's not quite the same as one of the drones that you could buy off Amazon, but it's quite a close cousin of that kind of drone. It's basically the same idea, a bit bigger and a bit more robust, but it's basically the same sort of thing. And anyone who can fly a civilian drone can potentially fly one of these things just as easily. And again, the thing about drones is that they are expendable. They are, if one gets shot down, well, you're not losing a pilot. And they are, relatively speaking, extremely cheap. For the cost of one of these jet fighters or even one of these helicopters, you could buy thousands and thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of drones. So the potential for swarm attacks, really kind of, again, if you're kind of interested in this, I suggest looking at paying close attention to the Ukraine war and the way that drones are being used there. But yes, certainly once again revolutionary. But once again, the drones that we see, the current generation of drones, remote controlled by humans, but once again the potential for fully autonomous drones, which could change the rules of the game once again. Space warfare, I mean, it looks kind of almost like science fiction, but, it's becoming increasingly, potentially reality, in that satellites are very, very useful for kind of directing warfare on Earth. Satellites can monitor what's going on the ground, they can direct forces on the ground, they can facilitate communications, so they are very, very useful. But because of that, there is then an incentive, of course, for the opposing power in a conflict to want to take your satellites out. There has been kind of experimentation with things like the use of lasers potentially to do that, for one satellite to shoot down another. And of course, satellites could be used for direct ground attack as well. They could carry out aerial bombardment or use directed energy weapons directed at the surface. Although we haven't really seen any instances of space warfare yet, the potential is obvious. This graphic just kind of shows some of the ways in which space warfare might play out. Cyber warfare, the new kid on the block, of course, but increasingly the cyber kind of blurs the boundaries between war and peace. You could argue that cyber war is currently happening. For example, between you could argue that Russia and the West are already in a state of cyber warfare. Cyber again has the potential to cause real problems. Again, you may think, cyber attacks, they may be annoying, but they're not going to kill anyone. Actually, they potentially could. So imagine, for example, if someone were to hack air traffic control and start crashing planes. And again, that might not even be a state actor. That could be a non-state group. Sounds like science fiction, but so did 9/11 until, 9/11 sounded like the plot of a movie until it happened. Or if someone were to hack train control signals, for example, or hack a nuclear power plant and set the reactor to overload. We can think of lots and lots of other scenarios where mass casualties could be caused through hacking attacks which targeted various types of systems. But even aside from that, thinking of the enormous economic damage that could be done. So imagine if someone hacked the stock exchange, hacked the banking system and started deleting bank accounts and so on. You could see how much damage that cyber warfare could potentially cause. And it also introduces a new element of instability into the international system, because again there are kind of no rules of war around cyber warfare, and norms are still emerging. What is an appropriate response to a cyber attack? And it may be that one power launches a cyber attack on another power in the in the belief that they have plausible deniability. It's kind of the threshold for launching a cyber attack might be much less than the threshold for launching a conventional attack, because they may not expect the attacking power may not expect huge consequences. But what if the target country actually decides to respond with a conventional attack? And again, that could well happen. I mean, NATO, a few years ago, I can't remember if it was 2017 or around then, NATO declared that a cyber attack, which was serious enough, could trigger the mutual assistance clause of the North Atlantic Treaty. So in other words, it could be treated as an act of war and may be responded to with conventional means. So This adds a new element of destabilisation into the international system, the possibility of a cyber attack escalating into conventional, what we call kinetic warfare. So I'll talk a bit now about weapons of mass destruction, so chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear weapons. So the destructive power of nuclear weapons is awesome. Is absolutely terrifying. A single bomb can destroy much of a city, for example. So if, for example, we were to detonate a 1 megaton bomb in the centre of Leeds, this would be the results. So there would be a huge fireball which would extend out, over a kilometre, and this fireball would incinerate and vaporise everyone and everything in the city centre, basically. There wouldn't be anything left to find. There wouldn't be any bodies. There wouldn't even be any charred sort of bones. You would just be vaporised instantly. Then out to over 2 kilometres, so the best part of a mile, there would be a tremendous air blast, which again would kill just about anyone who was caught up in it, and flatten pretty much all buildings within that radius. Further out, the air blast would be attenuated somewhat, but would still cause loss of life, collapsing buildings. So up to 5 kilometres out, most residential buildings would collapse, for example. And there would be huge loss of life. There would also be thermal radiation burns as far as 10 kilometres out, 11 kilometres out. The immediate radiation blast would spread out 2.5 kilometres. Even further out, the shock waves would be felt, so maybe not kind of flattening buildings, but certainly blowing windows in and damaging roofs and so on. But the real problem further out would be the fallout, because, again, going back to the previous slide, we can see this is a mushroom cloud, which basically, when the detonation happens, debris is sucked up into the atmosphere, and becomes kind of fine dust, which is then spread over a wide area, and this dust is radioactive, and this would kill people over a very wide area, as far away as Manchester, for example. They would be getting the effects of this, and probably even further away than that. So the estimated fatalities from this blast, so this single 1 megaton bomb in the centre of Leeds would kill maybe 250,000 people, and would injure a further 250,000 people. So devastating, absolutely devastating. But remember, this is just one bomb. If there were a full-scale nuclear war, the UK, for example, wouldn't be hit with one bomb, it would be hit with hundreds of them. Every major city and town across the UK would be hit with these things. There would be nothing left. Basically, the UK would be gone. It would be wiped off the map. I mean, there may be a few survivors, in remote regions, the far north of Scotland perhaps, there might be a few survivors, but, there would be nothing left, really, of the UK. I mean, the UK will be a radioactive wasteland. And the same is true, I mean, the UK is particularly vulnerable, because we are a densely populated, relatively territorially compact country. But, for any country, their major cities are going to be wiped out, are going to be gone, they're going to be absolutely devastated. Nuclear war, there aren't any winners, basically, in a nuclear war. There are only casualties. Of course, the only time, touch wood, the only time that such weapons have been used so far in practice was against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan in 1945. So here we have some pictures. Interestingly, there are still a few buildings standing, but most of the city flattened, and anyone within that area would have been dead, including the people in the buildings. But again, remember that this is these bombs were, very low yield compared to modern nuclear weapons. So, for example, if we compare the Hiroshima bomb, the size of the mushroom cloud created by the Hiroshima bomb, to the mushroom cloud that was created by the Tsar bomber, which is the largest nuclear weapon so far detonated by the Soviet Union during the Cold War period, we can see the difference. The difference in magnitude of World War II era atomic weapons compared with modern nuclear weapons. So these things are beyond devastating. They would be civilization ending. If nuclear war were to occur, it would be civilization ending. However, we shouldn't assume that, nuclear weapons are the only kind of threat, weapon of mass destruction kind of threat, because chemical weapons also have the potential to be absolutely devastating. And chemical weapons can be much more easily created and acquired, and particularly by non-state actors. So, in that respect, arguably even more dangerous. And again, the lethality of these things is staggering. So if you think of a US cent, if you're American, you'll be familiar with this. But many people across the world, I would imagine, have handled a US cent. So it's a small coin, slightly smaller than a British penny. And on the back of it is an image of the Lincoln Memorial. Now, an amount of VX nerve gas equal in size to just one of these columns on the Lincoln Memorial, so I'm not saying it's equal in size to the whole of the cent, just equal in size to one of these columns, so a tiny droplet, that would be lethal to a human being. And you wouldn't even need to inhale it, if you just that droplet dropping on the back of your hand and being absorbed into your skin, that would be enough to kill you. Now imagine this stuff, being sprayed around over a wide area, perhaps using drones. Just imagine if someone were to fly a swarm of drones over, carrying this kind of nerve gas and spray it over a crowd in a football stadium, for example. The results would be beyond horrific. Or spray it over a city, just fly it around a city, spraying, It's and again, the real worry is that these weapons are much more readily available to the non-state groups as well, to terrorists as well. Then we have biological warfare. So again, the use of things like anthrax as a biowarfare agent. It's been suggested that the destructive capability of weaponized anthrax could be equivalent to that of a nuclear bomb. So again, imagine perhaps a swarm of drones flying around, spraying anthrax spores around, and the carnage that could cause. Albert Einstein is quoted as saying, "I do not know with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones," and that really sums it up, because if we ever fight World War III, there won't be any civilization left to fight World War IV. We'll be back to the Stone Age. So, how do we secure the state in under these conditions? I mean, given the huge destructive power of modern weapons and the potential for civilization-ending devastation, how do we secure the state under those conditions? Well, there are two potential approaches. One is the traditional realist approach, the idea of security through strength. So again, I'm not going to rehash realism because that's in other videos, but basically, just to summarise very quickly, realists believe that the international system is characterised by anarchy, i.e. no government above and beyond that of nation states, no sovereign over the sovereign. Under conditions of anarchy, no state can afford to trust the others. Therefore, we have conditions of uncertainty. We have a self-help system, because if you don't help yourself, no one else is coming to help you. And we have a zero-sum game. In other words, we have a power struggle where, one state's relative gain in power is another state's loss. By definition, if one state gets stronger, then another state gets relatively weaker. So, under these conditions, realists argue that foreign policy should be based on national interest defined in terms of power. The state has one moral duty only, to protect its citizens. Realists value pragmatism, so they believe that considerations like ideology and morality and ethics, religion, emotion, none of that should be allowed to get in the way. The only thing that matters is power. And also a state's reputation matters as well. So it's not just about material capability solely, it's also about being perceived as having a reputation for being, strong, for having, the willingness to use your power, take decisive action. That is a factor as well. Related to this is the idea of deterrence, so the idea that peace can be secured through deterrence, which is a relatively simple idea, although it can lead to lots of convoluted logical scenarios. But the basic idea is very simple: that the attack can be prevented by making the cost to the enemy too high. So if your adversary knows that they are likely to be badly hurt, even if they win, the cost of attacking will be too high to make it worthwhile. A good example of this is the British nuclear deterrent. So again, if the UK and Russia fought a nuclear war, the UK would be wiped out because Russia has thousands of nuclear warheads and would wipe the UK off the map. However, although Russia wouldn't be completely destroyed, it would be very, very badly damaged. Moscow would be gone, St. Petersburg would be gone, probably several other Russian cities would be gone as well, even if the rest of NATO didn't join in. So again, this is an example of states not fully trusting others. Britain has its own independent nuclear deterrent, which means that even if Russia were to attack the UK, even if the US and other powers refuse to join in, the UK on its own can nuke Russia, not as thoroughly as they can nuke us, but enough to do immense damage to Russia. And the idea is that Russia, although Russia might kind of win in a sense, in that the UK would be gone and Russia would kind of still exist, but Russia would be so badly damaged that it wouldn't be worth their while. There would be millions of Russians dead, the capital city would be gone, several of their other cities would be destroyed, they would be so badly hurt that it's not worth their while to attack the UK. That's the idea of the British nuclear deterrent. And if you're interested in the logic of deterrence, it's quite an old book, but written in kind of a late Cold War context. Anthony Kenny, The Logic of Deterrence, from 1985. Worth a read if you can get hold of a copy. The idea of the balance of power. So again, to a realist, the balance of power is very simple. If one state is much more powerful than the other states in a system, then it will automatically be seen as a threat. Even if it hasn't actually committed any acts of aggression yet, just the fact that it could conquer any of the other states makes it threatening to the others. So the others are automatically going to identify state A in this system, are going to identify state A as a threat, and they're going to want to do something about it. What are they going to do? Well, first of all, they could build up the size of their own militaries. So, they build more jet planes and more tanks and recruit more soldiers and maybe build nuclear warheads or whatever. They get stronger, but they still don't match the power of State A, not on their own. So the other thing that they can do, of course, is to form an alliance. And now, collectively, the BCD alliance can balance the power of State A. This is what we mean by a balance of power, which realists see as a sort of natural, particularly people like Kenneth Waltz see this as a sort of a natural feature of the international system. So yeah, it's important to realise that, and particularly from a defensive realist standpoint, so a defensive realist would be someone like Kenneth Waltz, balancing and deterrence are not about promoting aggression, but about preventing conflict and ensuring stability by making the adversary reluctant to attack. So it's not about saying war is good, let's have lots of wars. It's about saying the best way to prevent war is to be strong enough that, you know, your potential enemies are reluctant to attack you. So the idea, the old adage of if you want peace, prepare for war. However, there is a flaw in this, and the flaw is that it assumes rationality on both sides. What if one side or the other is irrational or simply miscalculates? You know, what happens if someone gets hold of nuclear weapons, for example, who doesn't care if they die? Perhaps they're religiously motivated, perhaps they think they're going to heaven or whatever if they die a martyr, so they've nothing to lose. You know, if one side or the other is irrational or just miscalculates, you know, brinkmanship gone wrong is another scenario in which nuclear war could break out. So deterrence, you know, could fail under those conditions. A related idea is the idea of the security dilemma. So the idea that by making yourself stronger, you know, actions which are kind of taken with defence in mind can appear threatening to other states. So if I'm a state and I say, okay, I'm worried about state B next door, I'm state A, I'm worried about state B next door, so in order to ensure that they don't attack me, I'm going to get really strong, I'm going to build up my military, I'm going to become so strong that state B won't dare to attack me. But that then makes me appear threatening to state B, and state B looks at me and says, the state next door is tooling up. I need to do the same. You know, I need to tool up as well to protect myself. And then of course I look at state B and I say, yes, state, you know, I was right all along. State B is you know, arming. I need to arm even more. I need to get even stronger. And of course then they're going to look at me and they're going to do the same thing. Of course this is what creates what we know as an arms race. And the thing is, under such conditions, when we have an arms race going on, that kind of also has the effect of making both sides more and more paranoid about each other. It causes deteriorating relations, it makes both sides increasingly paranoid, and it's under those conditions in particular that the chances of miscalculation resulting in conflict are heightened. So yeah, you know, that's the dilemma. By trying to kind of make yourself more secure, you end up making yourself less secure. So yeah, the realist, you know, model, you know, potentially can be dangerous and arguably can directly lead to conflict. And again, arguably, this is what happened in 1914 and the years leading up to that. And of course, the horror of the First World War, as I kind of mentioned previously, the carnage of that conflict therefore encouraged efforts to find an alternative approach, because it was seen as the kind of the power politics approach had failed and resulted in this horrendous conflict. And so this led to in the sort of years immediately after the First World War, what we might call the liberal approach coming to the fore, the idea of peace through multilateralism, the idea of peace through collective security. So again, students often confuse these two terms because they sound similar, collective security and collective defence, but they mean different things. So collective defence is the sort of stuff that a realist would recognise. A group of states forming an alliance to defend each other against an external threat. So NATO would be a good example of that, formed to counter the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Collective security is a different concept. So under a collective security system, all states ideally are part of a single global organisation that has rules. So we're talking about a rules-based order. And one of the cardinal rules is that member states must not attack one another. And if one state within the system does attack another, breaks the rules, then the other states will collectively take action to enforce the rules. So that's the idea that underpins the League of Nations and ultimately underpins the United Nations as well. So yeah, the League of Nations set up in the wake of the First World War, basically to implement this concept. However, of course, it didn't work because the Second World War broke out. The League was, flawed in many respects. So the USA never joined. The USSR did join, but then left under Stalin after just a few years. Germany under the Nazi regime left. Imperial Japan left. Italy under the fascist regime left. So the whole thing kind of fell apart. And the League failed to prevent things like Japan's invasion of China and the atrocities committed there. It failed to prevent Italy attacking Abyssinia and conquering Abyssinia, or Ethiopia as we know it today. Of course, it didn't prevent Hitler's territorial ambitions in Europe, and ultimately the invasion of Poland in 1939, which led to the Second World War. So the League failed to prevent the Second World War. Nonetheless, after the war, another attempt was made to set up a collective security system in the form of the United Nations. So here we see the signing ceremony for the UN Charter. Now the UN was a little bit different to the League in that, whereas the League was kind of a pure liberal concept, if you like, a kind of pure sort of collective security, the idea of kind of one state, one vote, and the idea that all member states would be equal. Have equal status within the League. That was seen to have not worked very well. So the successor organisation, the UN, although it was still kind of based on this liberal collective security principle, it did also incorporate an element of realist thinking. So the five victorious great powers in the Second World War, which were the USA, the USSR, UK, France and China, were given permanent seats on the Security Council. The Security Council being the UN's kind of highest decision-making body, particularly with regards to matters of war and peace, upholding the rules around aggression and so on, and military intervention, and any kind of military intervention has to be authorised by the Security Council. And the permanent five members were given the power of veto over any decisions taken by the Security Council. So there are 15 members of the Security Council, 10 of which are kind of elected by the General Assembly, but only the permanent five have the power of veto. So decisions are taken by kind of majority vote, but even if 14 of the others vote to do something, if any one of these five were to veto it, then that decision doesn't happen. That decision falls, which may seem very unfair, but that's the whole point. It's not meant to be fair. It's meant to reflect power realities. Of course, the power realities of 1945 are not necessarily the same power realities of today. So in 1945, following the defeat of the Axis powers, I think it was fair to say that these five countries were the most powerful in the world. That's probably less true today for some of them. I mean, the USA and China, and to an extent Russia as well, but particularly militarily, we could say are still kind of great powers, superpowers. The UK and France probably less so nowadays. I mean, the UK and France do still have a significant amount of power on the international stage, but nothing like, not comparable to the US or China, for example. But at least in 1945, they were part of the big five powers in the world, and this was kind of the idea that it was kind of a recognition that in order for decision making to work, particularly on matters of war and peace, you had to have all of the major powers in agreement. The problem with kind of making it a kind of fair and equal vote, so let's say you gave every country, every UN member an equal vote. Well, if the UN voted by majority to do something, but the great powers didn't agree, they could just ignore it. You know, the US could say, well, we don't care what the UN's voted for because we're the US, so we're going to do what we want anyway. And similar with, you know, China or Russia, for example. So the idea is that by giving the great powers a veto, you ensure that UN decision making will never conflict with the interests of the great powers. The drawback of that is that it very often paralyses the UN, because getting agreement among these 5 countries is often very difficult. You know, whatever the US and UK and France want to do very often will be vetoed by Russia and China, and vice versa. So the effect of that is to paralyse the UN in many cases. So this is the structure of the UN. So I'm kind of not going to go into detail about, because that's not kind of the purpose of this lecture. But this is where kind of the Security Council sits within the UN structure. Security Council charged with maintaining peace and order. It is the only UN body that can make binding resolutions. So the General Assembly can make resolutions, and those resolutions have arguably a lot of moral force, but they are not legally binding. The decisions of the Security Council, at least in theory, are legally binding on member states. It can authorise military action. It can also authorise peacekeeping forces, and again, for a peacekeeping force to be dispatched, that requires Security Council authorisation. But at the same time, of course, the UN doesn't have any forces of its own. There is no UN military. The UN relies on member states to provide the forces for peacekeeping or intervention operations. To summarise today's lecture then, so national security essentially means defence of the state itself. So in other words, remember we talked about the idea of the referent object. What is the thing that we are securing? From a national security perspective, the referent object, the thing we are securing, is the state itself. Traditionally, the main threats were seen as coming from other states. Today, of course, the huge destructive power of modern weapons raises questions about how do we secure the state in the face of such threats. So again, 2 key approaches. The realist approach is about peace through strength, self-help, deterrence, allies, building balances of power. But the problems with that is that it can lead to the security dilemma, it can lead to arms races, which brings with it the danger of miscalculation, the potential for spiral into war. The alternative is the kind of the liberal approach, the multilateral approach, the collective security approach. So again, the rules-based order, and also things like arms control treaties as well, to kind of try to prevent arms races or even reverse the effects of arms races. The problem with that is that, can it be made to work? Can states trust each other enough to make this system work? Okay, so that's all for this week. So next week we'll be looking at intrastate security. So in other words, we'll be looking at conflicts within the borders of a state, which we might sometimes call civil wars, but civil war has a kind of a slightly more specific meaning. But conflicts within the borders of states will be next week's topic. Okay, thanks for listening, and I'll see you at the next lecture.